hope you're all doing really well. There's been a few changes since I last made a video. Firstly, I've moved house. I actually bought an apartment earlier this year and I finally was able to move into it a couple of weeks ago. It is the tiniest little one-bedroom flat, but it's in an amazing location right down the road from one of my favorite cinemas. There's a whole story around why I decided to buy a house right now. Mainly my sister, who I was living with before, was going to move overseas. Obviously she can't do that now, but at the time I sort of felt I either had the option of renting a one-bedroom apartment or buying one, and it turns out the mortgage for this apartment was actually going to be cheaper than renting each week. So I decided I would finally use all my savings. I do have to say I am super lucky to be able to buy a house. I know a lot of people my age, it's not even an option for them. I've just been lucky enough to have had a full-time job for quite a while now, as well as live in a city that's not as expensive as, for example, Sydney and Melbourne. So I could just about afford this tiny little apartment. This is also my first time living completely alone, and it's only been 2 weeks. It's been interesting. I don't mind being alone at all. Moving during the middle of a pandemic and working from home was definitely a challenge, though we are so lucky in Australia and Western Australia particularly in that our cases are so low that things are actually returning back to normal somewhat. I'm still working from home because my office is being renovated, so that's been a bit more of a challenge. I think if I had the routine of being able to go into an office and see people every day, it wouldn't feel quite so strange living alone. So yeah, I'm really hoping that I can start to be more frequent with my videos and try out some different videos that I've never done before, like reading vlogs, but I also don't want to make any promises. Anyway, let's get to the actual content of this video, which is a wrap-up of the last 4 books that I read. So first up we have The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I sort of read this just in case I would be asked to review the new Secret Garden film, which I think is still going to be coming out this year, and also because I reread A Little Princess recently and I loved it so much that I wanted to see whether I would feel the same way about this book. For those of you who don't know, The Secret Garden is a children's book from the Edwardian era. It's about a girl called Mary who has been brought up in India with very distant parents and is incredibly spoiled. A fever hits the part of India that she's living in, killing her parents. So she is moved to her uncle's manor on the Yorkshire moors, a very cold and empty place where she's basically left alone to do whatever the hell she wants, but finds she is drawn to being out in the garden, where she learns from a gardener that there is a secret garden. No one has been inside it for 10 years. I think Frances Hodgson Burnett really pinpoints things that would light up a child's imagination. The idea of a secret garden in a giant spooky manor is something that's always delighted me. However, because of the execution of the way it's written, I found it quite hard to get into actually. Quite the opposite of A Little Princess. I found the way it was written quite repetitive and moralizing in a very on-the-nose way. It doesn't let you just observe Mary's character and how she changes throughout the book. It tells you what she's like and it tells you how she's changing. And I guess as a child I didn't really care about that, but as an adult I found that extremely frustrating and very clunky, and yeah, it made me quite sad that I didn't really enjoy this when it was such a favourite of mine when I was a kid. But I am tempted to watch the 90s film version because I think that probably does a better job of showing rather than telling. Next, I read The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This was one I got out of the library just before the libraries had to close, though thankfully they are open again. But with the whole lockdown I thought I would try and tackle some longer books that I'd been meaning to read for a while. This one is about a group of very posh and pretentious university students in, I guess, an East Coast American university in the 90s. Definitely the feel of it and the atmosphere reminded me very much of Walt Whitman films, who loved to make films in the 90s about young, rich, intellectual Americans. It's not a spoiler to say that a murder happens in this book because it says right at the beginning of the book that this group of students kill one of their friends. And so basically the first half of the book is the lead up to that murder, and I really flew through that part. I found the way Donna Tartt built the tension was really well done. I really enjoyed reading the descriptions of the ridiculous intellectual way all these characters talked and the strange things that they were interested in. It really had the feel of like a Netflix TV teen drama, very sort of over the top and slightly debauched, but also very easy to consume. However, the second half after the murders happened, the tension just completely completely drops away, and I felt like the book entirely dragged on. I understand why Donna Tartt wrote it like that, because you are almost in real time experiencing the protagonist's descent into chaos as the repercussions of what they've done begin to affect them, but I just found it so repetitive and so overly long, and the more you learnt about the characters, the more uninteresting they came across, which again also may have been the point of the novel, and also because it is from the point of view of Richard, the protagonist, who at first of course finds all these people so fascinating, and then once he gets to know them realizes they really aren't as incredible as he thought they were. It is quite bizarre reading a book where you can so distinctly split it into one very good part and one really not that good part. Next I read Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. This was an interesting reading experience because with all of Austen's other novels, I know the plots and the characters so well because of watching adaptations multiple times, but with Mansfield Park, because the adaptations aren't very good, I've only seen a few of them once, so I was really enjoying it at first because I didn't really remember the details of what happens, and the way Jane Austen presents these characters is as clever as in any of her other books. There really aren't any likable characters in this novel, and I include Fanny in that because although I know we're meant to like her, it's very hard to like someone who is so consistently good all the time. It was quite interesting reading the introduction of this book because it did talk about how she's such an unusual heroine, because usually with a main character they are going through an experience that changes them by the end of the novel, whereas in Fanny's case she is the one changing everyone else around her. At first I kind of thought, because you do get some chapters from Mary Crawford's point of view, that Jane Austen had almost divided her own personality into Fanny and Mary Crawford. Fanny possibly being the person that she wishes she could be, and Mary Crawford being the person that she hopes she never turns into, because Mary is so witty and quick and very good at observing character, but she also doesn't have a moral code to guide her. In the end, to me it seemed like Mary Crawford was a warning as to how an intelligent person can become a not very decent person purely because of the circumstances of their upbringing and the society that they move in. It would be fascinating to know whether Jane Austen's intention in writing this book was to give a kind of moral lecture. With all her other books it seems like her intentions are so clear in what she's doing with her characters, but maybe it's just because this is her least modern feeling book that we find it confusing now. I think there's definitely a lot of potential to make a really interesting adaptation. You'd have to change the story a lot. I certainly wouldn't be marrying Fanny to Edmund because they are first cousins, and I googled it and first cousins share about 12% of their DNA, which is just not acceptable, so you definitely have to change it around a lot to make it a bit more compatible to a modern audience as well as a bit more complex. But then again, would that be taking away from its purpose as it was written to be released in the early 1800s, and maybe trying to find a modern angle to this book simply because her other books feel so modern to us does a disservice to what Jane Austen was trying to do in the first place. Lastly, I have the Edwardian Spy Vita Sackville-West. I sort of picked this up on a whim because it sounded intriguing, and I've always been fascinated by the Edwardian era in particular. On the back it talks about a character, Sebastian, who's the heir to this estate in England, and he's conflicted between the old society of his mother and his mother's friends and new ideas around the aristocracy not being particularly relevant anymore. All things that I find very intriguing. I think the Edwardian era is fascinating because it is that transitionary period between the Victorian age and everything that happened in World War I. It would be fascinating to see a parallel world where World War I didn't happen, to find out whether society would have progressed in the same way without a war suddenly changing everything. So anyway, this book was not what I was expecting, unfortunately, because Sebastian isn't really the main character for ages. Right at the beginning, it's mainly from the point of view of his mother and his mother's friend, Lady Roehampton, who has an affair with Sebastian. I suppose what Sackville-West was doing was showing the point of view of people from an older era and then slowly moving to the points of view of younger people to give an overview of what was happening at that time, because this book was written in the 1930s, but I just found it was written in a way that wasn't particularly interesting. There were a lot of really interesting themes sort of floating around, but she never really focused on any of them. There was a lot of focus on stuff that I just didn't find that interesting. One of the most fascinating sounding characters, Viola, who's Sebastian's younger sister, who refuses to be a part of the society society and eventually goes and lives on her own in London, which would have been so scandalous at the time. She never gets a point of view, or only very briefly. And basically I just felt like this book was focusing on the least interesting parts of the story, for me anyway. This book was a huge hit when it came out in the 1930s. There must have been something about the nostalgia of it. I suppose it's like if someone wrote a book about the 90s now and how that was the end of an era before the early 2000s, which you could write about and would be really interesting. So those are the last 4 books that I read. Let me know if you've read any of them in the comments, and I will hopefully see you in another video soon. Bye!